Today, we're going to be talking about Saturn and Gemini through each of the houses. So, if you have this placement, you are in the right place. With that being said, then we're going to talk about a few celebrities that have this placement, and then the breakdown through each of the houses. So, check which house Saturn and Gemini is for you, and check the timestamps to skip to that part. But here is the general overview. Saturn is about our limitations, obstacles, and it's about pessimism. It's about blockages, and it's just things that operate as obstacles in our life. And Gemini is the sign that represents the mind. It represents how we think and how we communicate. So for one, Saturn and Gemini can manifest as having certain communication blockages. For one, you could have a blocked throat chakra. You could be less expressive of your thoughts, or you could be shy or reluctant to speak, especially early on in life. However, Saturn gets better over time, and eventually you master the skill of communication through the trials and tribulations of life, and through, getting out of your comfort zone and facing this fear. So that's the other key word about Saturn that I didn't mention, which is fear. So there can be fears around communication, or there can be literal speech impediments. That is in the most direct expression of it. In other cases, Saturn in Gemini can manifest as pessimistic thoughts. And what is Saturn again? Saturn is about walls and blockages. So people with Saturn and Gemini, sometimes they can deal with thoughts that only flow in one direction. They can have a pessimistic way of thinking, or their thoughts can kind of be stuck between two walls, and kind of flow only in the direction of gloominess. They can flow towards negativity. If that makes any sense. Saturn really restricts the flow of things, and air signs like Gemini are about movement and flow. So this leads us to the third expression of Saturn and Gemini, is that it can restrict your movement in some sense, especially regarding the house that it's in. So when I say movement, this could really be about transportation, travel, the ability to get around. And anyway, Mercury rules Gemini, and Mercury is about deliveries, commuting. It's about transportation, vehicles. So Saturn can bring some delays when it comes to those things. So either you have difficulty with transportation, like you don't have a vehicle for a long time, or if you do, you might run into obstacles with it sometimes, or in general, the situations of life can confine you a little bit more and confine your movement. So that really explains Saturn and Gemini. Overall, it can be about a limited way of thinking and thoughts that only tend to flow towards the negative, or towards one certain direction. So in other words, Saturn and Gemini can create ego related limitations. And when I say the word ego is about our sense of self, and it's about the thoughts that go in our head, or that we think subconsciously, and those thoughts become how we define ourselves. So ego can either be positive or negative. Somebody can have a negative ego, where they always put themselves down, or they always have limiting thoughts. And another person can have a very strong, quote unquote, positive ego, where they feel good about themselves because of external things in their life, or because of things that they accomplish. So anyway, when Saturn is in Gemini, it can create ego related limitations, because your thoughts become a limitation or limiting factor. Saturn is about limiting factors, and it takes the form of thoughts, communication, and transportation when it's in the form of Gemini. So that is a brief overview of Saturn and Gemini. Now let's talk about a few celebrities that have displacement. Eminem, the rapper, has displacement. A Key example of somebody with dark lyrics, dark thoughts, and obviously somebody that has mastered communication in their lifetime. Sharon Tate has this placement. Elon Musk has this placement. If you listen to some of his interviews, he has quite uh, pessimistic, kind of realistic thoughts about reality. Like such that reality is a simulation and that we're in a matrix and all this stuff. So that's a key example of Saturn and Gemini. It's like boxed in type of thinking, or like a mind that creates a box, even if the box can be very realistic and makes sense. So another person with this placement is Billie Eilish. Another key example of an artist that has dark and pessimistic lyrics. Remember, Saturn is gloomy, it's based on fear, and it can create boxed in thinking. So, again, it can box in one's ego and create thoughts that flow always in one direction. And so, something I forgot to mention is Saturn in Gemini can create the phenomena of anxiety or worry, because that's what happens when Saturn is in the third house or the third sign, which is Gemini. Is it can be very self-critical, and it can represent fearful thinking. Another person is that has displacement is Cameron Diaz. Joe Biden has displacement. Um, he's somebody that is known for talking very slow. you know, Saturn expresses very uniquely in that case, but Saturn is about time, and it slows things down. Creates delays. Another person with displacement is Jim Morrison. There's Paul McCartney, Jared Leto, Ben Affleck, Vanessa Paradis, Mick Jagger, Jimi Hendrix, Victoria Beckham, Alyssa Milano, Robert De Niro, Sigmund Freud was a prominent philosopher, has displacement. So again, somebody with a deep and critical mind and kind of faces the deep or dark questions of life. Winona Ryder has displacement, I believe from Stranger Things. There's Jude Law, Gwyneth Paltrow, and a lot more people that have displacement that I have not listed. There's also Snoop Dogg, Christian Bale, Dwayne Johnson, The Rock, and many more. So now let's talk about what displacement means through each of the houses. When Saturn is in Gemini in the first house, this is the house of the self. This is the house of identity. So Saturn is showing boxed in or limited thinking around one's self concept. So sometimes you have tendencies of self criticism, or like your thoughts and what you think is possible might limit your self concept or something like that. Over time, you overcome this fear of communication or within the thinking, and you develop this ability of communication very well, and you gain a lot of authority in your speech, so people listen to you and look up to you. That's what Saturn shows being in the first house. Saturn in Gemini in the second house will show sometimes fearful thinking around money and finances. Also, it could be a this tendency to be very frugal and to limit your amount of like spending, because Gemini is ruled by Mercury. Mercury is about transactions, trade, commerce, etc. So I'd say that those with Saturn in the second house, they're very financially smart or frugal, although they might have a difficulty taking risk on business ideas or opportunities at times, because they could be too pessimistic, or they might always have this thought process that they don't have enough or something like this. So next, and this is because the second house is about resources, finances. It's about having stuff. So okay, next this leads us to Saturn and Gemini in the third house. This is one of the placements that will show limited or restricted movement. Like you could have literal, government restrictions on driving or something like this, like maybe invalid license or different things related to authority, structure, and government, because Saturn represents government, laws, rules, and credentials. And since it's in the third house, this is about the ability to get around, like Mercury. Mercury rules the third house. He was the god of transportation in Greek mythology and like delivering messages, and he would just get around a lot. So that's one thing. Secondly, in the third house, Saturn will show pessimistic thinking, which is what we already talked about with Saturn and Gemini. And the third house and Gemini are related; they rule each other. So, uh, there could just be this tendency of your thoughts only thinking towards one direction, or like towards a negative outcome, and so there could be worry or fearful thoughts as well. So next, this leads us to the fourth house. The fourth house is about emotions, vulnerability, and it's like our private life, our private self, and our internal life. So having Saturn in Gemini in the fourth house will show that you keep a lot of your thoughts to yourself, sometimes of just fear of being vulnerable, or them, making you uh vulnerable or a target or something. um Saturn in Gemini just generally shows boxed in thinking, or thoughts that flow only in one direction. So you have those kinds of thoughts when it comes to your emotions, or like your inner life or something. So it might be hard to express your true like feelings, or be open about your thoughts and opinions, because you may fear that they will be rejected, or that they can be too real, too dark, or too um, pessimistic. So, on a positive note, over time you overcome these fears of communication, and Saturn becomes a strength. So, you learn to master communication and vulnerability. And speaking your true thoughts give you authority, and set you apart from everybody else when you have Saturn and Gemini in the fourth house. So, next, this leads us to Saturn and Gemini in the fifth house. The fifth house is about confidence, capabilities, and self expression. So, this is one of those Saturn placements that can show blockages to one's self expression, or like willingness to communicate. And it could be about boxed in thinkings around your capabilities, or your confidence and your ego, because Saturn boxes things in, and when it's in Gemini, it boxes the thoughts in, or like creates limiting or pessimistic ways of thinking. And um on another hand, it can make somebody very very realistic, or like have realistic thinking, so it's not always negative. But your tendency to be very realistic about yourself and your own capabilities can sometimes uh cause you to dim your confidence, dim your light, because you can be overly humble or something like this, and you might avoid the position of spotlight, or avoid the position or moment to express yourself, because you feel like it's not your place or something, and because you might be being overly realistic or something. Saturn's about being realistic, and it's like your mind is thinking that way because it's in Gemini. And there could just also be a tendency for thoughts to flow only in one direction, like towards a downwards spiral, or like a negative direction, because Saturn controls the flow of things. So when it's in the fifth house, it might affect your willingness to express or something. Anyway, that is Saturn in Gemini in the fifth house. Over time, though, you become a master of communication. You overcome these fears of expression, and you radiate a lot of authority and competence in your thoughts and your opinions. So Saturn does get better over time. Next, this leads us to Saturn in Gemini in the sixth house. The sixth house is about tasks, organization, productivity, and it's about our lifestyle and our habits. Um, it is also a house that's ruled by Mercury, and Mercury represents busyness. Um, Gemini is ruled by Mercury as well, so this is a double Mercury placement. So a lot of times, those that have this placement, they will have very self-critical thoughts or like pessimistic way of thinking that's like overly realistic or like overly cynical. Um, as can be shown by the sixth house, because the sixth house is skeptical and it's all about observation and criticism. So sometimes the mind can struggle with perfectionism with Saturn is in the sixth house. Now, in terms of routine and the other meaning of the sixth house, which is like our work life and our tasks and responsibilities, these people can have a very rigorous job or like a time consuming career or something that's very mentally consuming, and it can drain their energy or it can take a lot out of them because it just is just consuming on their mind. There might be a lot of heavy thinking or like it could just be the colleagues that they're around as well, um, and having a very like high standard of workplace or like always being under scrutiny or something like this. So overall, Saturn can keep you very busy when it's in the sixth house, especially when it comes to your career. And this might be the factor that limits your movements or your freedom, which would be shown by Gemini. Saturn limits Gemini, um, and Gemini is about freedom and movement. And it's showing that it could be from work, busyness, or, time consuming tasks. Anyway, that is Saturn and Gemini in the sixth house. These people will become masters of their craft over time because Saturn gets better over time and eventually it shows mastery. So people become masters of the mind, masters of their craft because the sixth house is about what we do day in and day out. So they're able to, first of all, they become very smart or like competent at what they do, and they have a good eye for detail, and they become good communicators as well because there's the element of Gemini too, in this placement. So anyway, next this leads us to Saturn in Gemini in the seventh house. The seventh house is how we relate to others, and Gemini is about communication. So this combination of Saturn placements um, shows the energy of commitment. It's all about committing to your word because Saturn is what locks us in to things, and Saturn is about responsibilities. So it's showing that the responsibilities come from the things you say, and particularly the things that you say to others. Um, Furthermore, Saturn can show fears sometimes. So in this double air placement, because the seventh house is an air house and Gemini is an air sign, there can be this fear of rejection that limits one's communication or expressiveness at times. But once they overcome that fear, they are able to build strong and solid relationships and foundations, uh, especially due to the fact that Saturn shows the tendency to commit to their words. So, either one of two things will happen. Either they'll be very committed to their word, or these people will be very non-committal because they want to avoid the responsibilities of Saturn. So that's another way to describe this placement. So anyway, that is Saturn and Gemini in the seventh house. Next, this takes us to the eighth house placement of Saturn and Gemini. The eighth house is a malefic house. It's about things that are unknown, things that are out of our control. And one very obvious meaning that comes to mind when I see this placement is dark or negative thinking. Um, this is one of the Saturn and Gemini placements that will manifest like that because these people will have worries about the unknown or like they'll always think about the real meaning of things. Like they'll think about the deep and dark meaning of reality, or like they'll have existential type thought patterns. And remember that Saturn limits things, or like controls the flow of things. And when it's in Gemini, it controls the flow of one's thoughts, and usually they will sway more towards the negative direction. And when it's in the eighth house, this is towards darkness, or like existential questions at times. Um, Overall, Saturn will manifest positively later on in life, or it will like develop into a positive thing. So over time, these people go through a positive transformation in their mind and in their thinking. They might break out of a depressive state one day, or like they might go through a depressive state at some point. Um, and once they get out of it, it's like they have this whole other perception or concept, and they keep all the positive traits of Saturn, which is about critical thinking, competency, and like understanding. They radiate a lot of authority and wisdom due to the existential things that they've been through, or like um due to overcoming darkness, or like going through a personal transformation that required a lot of patience, time, and rigor, because Saturn's about patience, time, and rigor, and the eighth house is about transformation. And overall, the transformation will be a transformation to their mind, and they will leave that transformation like more optimistic, and also like way more like competent, and having way more understanding of reality, to the point that it becomes a advantage in their life. So that is Saturn and Gemini in the eighth house. Next, we have Saturn in Gemini in the ninth house. The ninth house is about beliefs. Gemini is about thinking, and Saturn is about pessimism or fear. So there can be fearful, limiting, or like mm, subconscious beliefs that limits one's self-concept or freedom or optimism, because the ninth house represents inspiration and optimism. So overall, Saturn shows that over time, once you overcome these fears and limiting beliefs, or once you become conscious of them, it opens up a lot of freedom for yourself, um, and a lot of optimism. People with Saturn in the ninth house will tend to have very realistic beliefs, or very grounded philosophy. Um, and another thing is, the ninth house represents education. So Saturn will show like a rigorous or difficult higher education. So things such as college and university. Um, and that could be something that weighs on their mind while they're going through it, because Saturn is in Gemini, which is about the mind, and it's about negative thinking, and it's also blocks movement, because Gemini is about movement. So the period of school can be difficult for these individuals, or like can be taxing on the mind and the mental health. There could be a lot of fears or worries about their performance. But overall, over time, Saturn manifests positively, and people overcome the fears of Saturn. So in later years, they overcome these limiting self concepts and limiting beliefs. They also graduate whatever programs they're a part of with higher credentials, and with higher credibility than they had before. So Saturn really just bestows great credibility to whichever house that it's in, and the ninth house is credibility from education or experience and knowledge. So I feel like overall, when they break through the fear of new experiences, or like break through the negative thinking, and they step into new experiences, Saturn bestows a lot of wisdom and credibility to them that other people respect, and it just makes them good teachers or guidance figures as well. And it can make them a lot of money as well, to have high credentials, because the ninth house is about abundance, fortune, and Saturn is about credibility, credentials, and authority. So this placement can manifest as a lot of wealth when they overcome limiting thoughts about what's possible, and like also about reality, and beliefs that they have about themselves or the world. So next, this leads us to Saturn, well, before we get into that, Saturn in the ninth house will also show very conservative beliefs or a conservative upbringing, like where the parents can have conservative religious beliefs or conservative educational beliefs and stuff. So that's important to note as well. And these can be taxing on the individual's mind or personal freedom. Even when they leave the home, they keep those thought patterns and those inner checks where like their mind keeps them in check, even when those parents are no longer around. And overall, it can go against their own personal will or their own personal um, intentions. So anyway, next this leads us to Saturn and Gemini in the 10th house. The 10th house is about reputation, status, success, and career. Gemini is about thoughts, communication, and opinions. So in the 10th house, one can struggle with gossip or like people talking about them or their like achievements and all this kind of stuff. So Saturn causes them to have to be very self-aware of their reputation, um, and be careful not to, create any scandals or like taint their image. Saturn in the 10th house can be the most successful placement or like can show the most successful people because Saturn likes to be in the 10th house and Saturn bestows the highest authority or respect. So when these people work very hard in their careers, they attain a high position, they make a lot of money, and they have a lot of respect. But as usual, Saturn always brings the element of limitations and boundaries to the chart. So when it's in the 10th house, it shows having to protect one's image or, carry themselves in a certain high manner, high regard, carry themselves well and always be self-aware of their image and stuff like that. And then Gemini just shows the tendency for people to gossip about them or like think about them a lot. So overall, there can be fears coming from that because Saturn represents fear. There can be this fear of what people think or what people will say about them and their reputation. And that could be one of the like expressions of Saturn in the 10th house in Gemini. And it could be more of an internal blockage rather than external. So anyway, that is Saturn when it's in the 10th house in Gemini. Next, this leads us to Saturn and Gemini in the 11th house. The 11th house is an air house. Gemini is an air sign, and air signs or placements are all about interaction, communication, and information. There's social placements. So Saturn and Gemini in the 11th house can show this fear of fitting in or like of not fitting in. And that fear, which is represented by Saturn, can manifest as them being more quiet or reserved or less expressive of their opinions and their thoughts because Gemini is about communication. Furthermore, Saturn traditionally ruled the 11th house, and it's all about being an authority over ourselves, making our own decisions, being independent, being rebellious. So these individuals find that they fit in better over time when they step into their own, individuality more, and when they step into a higher position of authority or maturity. When they assume more maturity than their peers, they realize, that's when they find their way of fitting in. And a lot of times, these people that have Saturn in the 11th house in Gemini, they will be leaders, bosses, or, professional examples for other people. Saturn is about profession, and in the 11th house, it's about setting ourselves apart. So, early on in life, like I was saying, they might have difficulty around the topic of fitting in because they don't know where they fit in. They might not feel like they're like everyone else, and it's because they're meant to play a role of leadership instead of being a commoner or just like a peer of everyone else and just fitting in like as an average youth. So anyway, overall, Saturn gets better over time and the fears tend to fade away, or they get overcome with life, with the experience of life. And so essentially, as these people mature, they make more and more friends, connections, and they gain a lot of respect and strength of their own in their own individuality as well. And this strength, or maturity or belief in themselves, also leads them to becoming more expressive of their opinions and becoming very convincing or persuasive communicators. So next, this leads us to Saturn in Gemini in the 12th house. This is kind of like the Saturn and Gemini placement in the ninth house, because traditionally, the 12th house was ruled by Jupiter, just like the ninth house is ruled by Jupiter. And Jupiter is about beliefs. Now, the difference between the ninth house and the 12th house is that the 12th house is about the subconscious mind. And the subconscious mind is made up of a lot of beliefs. So when Saturn is here, there is the presence of negative self concepts, or like negative subconscious beliefs that are due to a certain way of thinking that could be negative or could be more boxed in. So your imagination, which also is what the 12th house represents, can be boxed in, or like it can be limited in some way through pessimistic thinking or assumptions. And over time, Saturn gets better, so you overcome these assumptions, and the positive aspects of Saturn remain, which is about being realistic, competent, critical, and constructive. So over time, you overcome these limiting, subconscious beliefs that might limit your self-concept or what you think you're capable of. And you have this ability to create a lot of success for yourself through being a visionary and materializing your goals or your visions or your imagination in some way. Because Saturn is about construction, the 12th house is about imagination, and Gemini is about thinking or being clever. So also, when you overcome the fear of communication and you no longer fear being vulnerable for expressing your point of view, this translates into success for yourself. Because like I said, Saturn gets better over time, and Saturn represents success. So you're really meant to be a visionary in some sense and be open about your opinions or your ideas, and be able to command others or communicate to others those things so that they can happen, or so that people can help you or collaborate. So with that being said, that is Saturn in Gemini through each of the houses. Thanks for watching.